There's a moment, a fleeting, almost invisible moment, when something inside us shifts. A word spoken the wrong way. A gesture misinterpreted. A disappointment we didn't expect. And suddenly it happens. That spark. That tightness in the chest. The heat rising to the face. A silent storm gathering behind the eyes. We call it anger, but it's more than a passing emotion. It's an invisible flame, a fire we often can't see, yet it consumes us from within. And what's strange is that most of us don't even notice how easily we invite it in. Like an old friend we swear we've left behind, yet we find ourselves making room for it at the table once again. Some people hold onto anger for hours, others for days, months, or even years, replaying conversations that have long since ended, nurturing grudges like delicate plants, carrying old wounds as though they offer some kind of protection. But here's a truth we rarely admit. Anger never punishes the one who caused it. It punishes the one who holds it. The Buddha taught this over 2,500 years ago. He described anger as a blazing torch, one that burns the hand of the person clinging to it, long before it ever reaches its intended target. And yet, despite knowing this, we still grip it tightly. You see, anger isn't born out of strength. It's born out of pain, out of unmet expectations, out of the illusion that the world should bend to our will. When it doesn't, when people act in ways we dislike, when circumstances betray our plans, that fragile image of control shatters, and anger rushes in to fill the void. It whispers to us, "You've been wronged." It convinces us, "You deserve better." It promises, "If you strike back, you'll feel whole again." But it's a liar. Have you ever watched a fire consume a house in minutes? Wood that took years to form. Walls carefully built to protect and shelter, gone in a single blaze. That's what anger does to the mind. It devours peace. It destroys compassion. And it leaves behind only ash and regret. What's worse is that most of us think we can control it. That we can allow a little anger, just enough to prove a point, to defend our pride, to settle a score, without letting it consume us. But as every spiritual master has warned, there is no such thing as safe anger. Even a single spark can turn a forest to dust. I once heard a monk say, "If you truly wish to measure the strength of a person, watch how long they hold onto anger. The wise," he said, "release it in a moment, because they understand something the rest of us often forget. That anger is a visitor, not a resident. It knocks on the door of your heart, but you don't have to invite it in, or worse, offer it a room." In Buddhist teachings, anger is one of the three poisons, along with greed and ignorance, that cloud the mind and bind us to suffering. It's considered so dangerous, not because it makes us shout or slam doors, but because it blinds us. It strips away our clarity. It makes us forget our true nature. And when we lose sight of that, even for a moment, we risk becoming something we are not. And here's the most tragic part: anger leaves us lonelier than before. Because when we cling to it, we build walls. We cut ourselves off. We trade understanding for righteousness and peace for bitterness. Yet, there is a way out. A way not to banish anger forever, because anger, like any emotion, will arise. But to see it for what it is, a flickering flame, momentary, insignificant, and entirely under your power to extinguish. The wise don't deny their anger. They don't suppress it or pretend it isn't there. They see it, name it, breathe through it, and let it go, all within a single moment. And that is the art we've forgotten. The ability to feel deeply but not be consumed. To witness anger rise and choose not to hold it. Not because we're weak, but because peace matters more. Because clarity is worth protecting. Because our hearts were never meant to be prisons for the fire. And perhaps the real question isn't why do we get angry, but why do we keep it? As we journey ahead, we'll unravel this invisible chain. We'll look deeper into what anger truly is, where it hides, and why it so easily takes root in us. Not to condemn ourselves, but to free ourselves. Because the greatest wisdom isn't in never feeling anger. It's in knowing you don't have to carry it. Let's begin. If you asked most people what anger is, they might say it's an emotion, a reaction, a natural part of being human. But the Buddha saw it differently. He didn't describe anger as just a fleeting feeling. He called it a poison, a mental defilement, a dangerous force that blinds the mind and severs the connection between a person and their true, awakened nature. In Buddhist philosophy, anger is known as dosa in Pali. It isn't merely rage or fury. It can be irritation, annoyance, resentment, even subtle aversion towards something we dislike. Like a shadow that changes shape but never leaves your side, anger wears many disguises. Sometimes it looks like a clenched fist. Other times, a cold silence, a sarcastic word, a memory you refuse to let go of. And Buddhism teaches that it's not the intensity of the anger that matters, it's the attachment to it. Even the faintest ember, if left unchecked, can smolder beneath the surface and one day ignite. The Buddha compared anger to a hot coal we pick up with the intention of throwing it at someone else, only to burn ourselves in the process. It is, by its very nature, self-destructive. But here's where the teaching becomes truly profound. In the Buddhist view, anger doesn't arise independently. It's not something the world does to us. It arises from within, from our own expectations, our attachments, our cravings for how we believe things should be. When reality refuses to cooperate with our desires, when people don't behave as we wish, when life turns in a direction we didn't choose, anger appears. It's a symptom of our own misunderstanding, a misalignment between our imagined world and the one we're living in. And in this way, Buddhism reminds us of something most forget. Anger is not caused by others. It is caused by our reaction to them. That's why two people can experience the exact same insult. One will laugh, the other will rage. The difference isn't in the insult. It's in the mind that receives it. The Buddhist texts describe anger as one of the three poisons, along with greed, labha, and delusion, moha. These three are the root causes of all suffering in the world. While greed pulls us toward things and delusion blinds us from truth, anger pushes us away. It creates division between ourselves and others, between ourselves and peace. It's an energy that seeks to destroy, not heal. And that's why it's considered so dangerous. Because the damage it does isn't always visible. It festers quietly, eats away at compassion, distorts perception, and hardens the heart. Many Buddhist masters teach that the greatest tragedy of anger isn't what it does in a single moment. A harsh word, a slammed door, a broken relationship. It's what it takes from you in the hours, days, and years that follow. It steals your clarity. It turns friends into enemies. And perhaps worst of all, it makes you believe you are right to be consumed by it. That's its most seductive lie. But Buddhism doesn't ask you to suppress your anger. It doesn't demand that you pretend you're never upset. In fact, the teachings are beautifully human in their approach. The Buddha acknowledged that anger will arise. It's natural, like hunger or thirst. What matters is what you do when it appears. Do you feed it, cling to it, use it as a weapon? Or do you recognize it, breathe through it, and release it before it takes root? The practice of mindfulness, sati, is the first defense. It allows you to see anger as it arises, not as a failure, but as a visitor passing through. And like any visitor, you can choose whether to offer it tea or show it the door. Buddhist meditation practices like loving-kindness, metta bhavana, and compassion, karuna, are designed to dissolve anger at its source, not by forcing positivity, but by expanding the heart so wide that anger no longer fits inside. When you sit quietly, watching your breath and notice irritation rising, a thought, a memory, an imagined slight, you can pause. You can see it not as your enemy, but as your teacher. Because every flicker of anger reveals where you are still attached, where you are still clinging, where you have not yet made peace with impermanence. And in that way, every moment of anger becomes an invitation, not to fight, but to awaken. This is why the wise don't hold anger for more than a moment, not because they never feel it, but because they see it for what it is: a spark, a shadow, a ripple in the water of the mind. And just as easily as it arose, it can be let go, not with force, but with understanding. Because to release anger is not to lose power, it is to reclaim it, to choose peace over poison, to remember who you are beneath the flame. And the more you practice this, the more you realize something remarkable: that most of what angers you was never worth carrying in the first place. And so, as the journey continues, we'll look deeper into how this anger disguises itself. Not always as shouting or violence, but sometimes as quiet bitterness, subtle judgments, old wounds we pretend we've forgotten. Because before we can release it, we must learn to see it clearly. And in doing so, we begin to set ourselves free. Most people think of anger as one thing: a burst of rage, a shouted word, a clenched fist. But the truth is, anger is not a single emotion, it's a layered experience. A tangled web of feelings stacked upon one another, like sediment at the bottom of a river. And unless we learn to recognize these layers, we'll mistake the surface storm for the entire ocean. Buddhist wisdom teaches that anger wears many faces, some obvious, some so subtle you might live with them for years without ever knowing their true name. Today, we'll unravel them, one by one. Because once you can name your demons, they lose their power over you. Layer 1, irritation. It begins here, a twitch in your chest, an unexpected inconvenience. Someone interrupts you, traffic slows, a stranger's careless word. You brush it off, or so you think. But that spark doesn't vanish, it waits. And when it finds another spark, it doubles in strength. Irritation is the seed, and every forest fire starts with a single ember. Layer 2, frustration. When the small things pile up, when your patience thins, when what you want stubbornly refuses to happen, frustration is anger's apprentice. It learns your triggers, it whispers that life is unfair, that people should know better, that the world owes you something. And if left unchecked, it feeds the next layer. Layer 3, resentment. Now the anger begins to grow roots. Resentment is anger remembered, an old injury you carry like a wound beneath your skin, a betrayal you replay in your mind, a grudge you disguise as indifference. It lingers in conversations you have alone at night, in the stories you tell yourself about how you were wrong. And Buddhism reminds us, when you hold resentment, you drink poison and expect the other person to die. Layer 4, contempt. This is anger turned cold, not a flame but ice. Contempt looks down on others. It labels them inferior. It strips them of their humanity. It convinces you that you are right, righteous, superior. But this is the most dangerous kind, because it feels justified. And justified anger is the hardest to let go. Layer 5, bitterness. When contempt hardens, bitterness forms. A quiet, persistent ache, a belief that life has cheated you. That happiness belongs to others but not to you. It whispers, why should I forgive? Why should I move on? Bitterness makes the heart heavy. It weighs you down long after the reason for your anger has vanished. It is grief disguised as defiance. Layer 6, vengefulness. When anger reaches this depth, it wants to strike back, not always in dramatic ways. Sometimes through silent sabotage, withholding kindness, nurturing the hope that those who hurt you will one day suffer as you did. Vengefulness convinces you that the only way to feel whole is to make others bleed. But as the Buddha warned, hatred never ends by hatred, it ends by love. Layer 7, self-hatred. Here is a truth most never realize. Anger isn't always aimed outward. Sometimes its sharpest blades turn inward. You criticize yourself for past mistakes. You carry guilt. You replay failures in an endless loop. Buddhism teaches that self-hatred is anger tangled with delusion, a refusal to see your own inherent worth. And it may be the hardest layer to heal. Because how do you forgive yourself when you've been your own executioner? Layer 8, righteous anger. The final, trickiest mask. Anger on behalf of others. Anger in the name of justice. Anger that feels noble, and sometimes it is. But even here, the Buddha warned of danger. Because even righteous anger can consume you. It can become an identity. A shield you use to justify cruelty, to cling to pain, to refuse the difficult work of compassion. The wise understand, you can fight injustice without hatred. You can stand for truth without being devoured by rage. That is the path of awakened warriors. And so, we see, anger is not simple. It is not a single storm, but a sky of clouds. Some are dark and violent. Some barely cast a shadow. But all of them, if left unexamined, steal your light. Buddhist practice asks you to notice these layers as they arise. Not to judge them, not to deny them, but to witness. Because every time you name a layer, this is frustration, this is resentment, this is self-hatred. It loosens its grip, like a knot that unravels with each breath. And when you learn to see anger not as a monolith, but as a spectrum, you gain a new kind of freedom. You realize that most of your suffering doesn't come from what happens to you, but from the invisible flames you carry within. And so our journey moves deeper, because if anger wears these 8 masks, how many of them have we worn today? And more importantly, what might it feel like to finally lay them down? There's an old saying in Buddhist teachings, holding on to anger is like grasping a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. But you are the one who gets burned. It sounds simple, but we rarely realize how often we do it. We carry anger in our hearts, not for a moment, not for an hour, but for years, sometimes for a lifetime. And what's the true cost of that, more than you think? It steals your peace. You might not feel it right away. In the heat of anger, there's a strange kind of power, a fire in the chest, a surge of control. But like all fires, it consumes the very thing that holds it. It interrupts your sleep. It poisons your thoughts. It turns your memories into battlegrounds. You replay old conversations, rehearse what you should have said, relive what they did to you. Long after the moment has passed, your mind stays trapped inside it. It rewires your brain. Neuroscientists confirm what the Buddha taught centuries ago. The emotions you practice become your default. When you feed anger daily, your brain becomes quicker to react, slower to forgive. Your nervous system stays on edge. Your body releases stress hormones long after the danger is gone. You turn into someone you never meant to be, easily triggered, quick to lash out, slow to heal. And the ones who suffer most are often the people you love. It makes you sick. Modern medicine now knows what ancient wisdom already warned. Anger held too long damages the heart, raises blood pressure, weakens the immune system, leads to headaches, digestive problems, and chronic tension. But the deepest sickness is invisible. It's the heaviness in your chest when you wake up, the dull ache behind your smile, the sense of isolation when no one seems to understand what you carry. Buddhism calls this dukkha, a pervasive, subtle suffering that we learn to live with but never escape. It distorts your story. Anger doesn't just live in your body, it changes how you remember your past. Small slights become epic betrayals. Minor flaws turn people into monsters. Your story rewrites itself to keep your anger alive. And like a bad storyteller, it leaves out details. The moments of kindness, the complexity, the truth that maybe, just maybe, the person who hurt you was hurting too. But anger is a poor historian. It cares only about its own survival. It blocks your wisdom. In Buddhism, wisdom isn't knowing facts. It's seeing things clearly, and nothing clouds your vision like anger. When you're consumed by it, you can't see the present moment. You see only your grievance. You can't see your own flaws, only the faults of others. And so long as you hold that anger close, true insight will always stay one step ahead of you, like trying to catch the moon's reflection in a stormy pond. And perhaps worst of all, it postpones your peace. The day you say, "I'll be free when they apologize," or "I'll heal when they finally get what they deserve." You hand your inner peace to someone else. You delay your own happiness, waiting for a justice that may never come. And if it does, it never feels the way you thought it would. Because the real freedom isn't in revenge. It isn't in vindication. It's in release. It's the moment you decide, "I will no longer let this live rent-free in my mind. I choose peace, not because they deserve it, but because I do." And the Buddha taught this not as philosophy, but as survival, because he knew what we're just beginning to remember. You cannot build a calm life on a foundation of old anger. It will leak into your days, color your relationships, sabotage your joy, and every moment you hold it is a moment you miss the beauty happening now. A breeze through the window, the warmth of tea in your hands, the sound of someone's laughter, the small mercies of ordinary life. These are the moments anger steals first, and if you're not careful, it will take them all. So today, ask yourself, what has my anger cost me? How many hours, days, years have I spent reliving old wounds? And what might it feel like to finally set them down? Not for them, for you, because peace is not something anyone else can give you. It's a choice you make when you realize you're the one still holding the coal, and you have the power to let it go. If you've ever wondered, how do enlightened beings handle anger? Do they get angry like us? Do they suppress it, ignore it, or are they somehow beyond it? The truth is more subtle and far more powerful, because wise beings don't suppress their anger, and they don't indulge it either. They understand it, and by understanding it, they dissolve its grip. In Buddhism, the Buddha was never described as a cold, indifferent figure. He felt sadness. He knew disappointment. He witnessed betrayal. And yet, his mind remained unshaken, not because he didn't care, but because he saw clearly the nature of anger. He understood where it comes from and where it leads. Anger arises from attachment to how things should be, attachment to fairness, to control, to our image, our pride, our expectations. When the world doesn't align with these attachments, anger flares. But the enlightened see this chain reaction for what it is, a mind clinging to illusions, a fire sparked by delusion, a momentary storm in the vast sky of awareness, and they respond not with suppression, not with indulgence, but with presence. When anger arises in a wise being, they don't say, "I shouldn't feel this." They simply notice, anger is here. They become aware of its heat, its tightness in the chest, the rush in the blood. They observe it as you might watch clouds drift across the sky. And in that pure, unbiased observation, something remarkable happens. The anger loses its fuel because it feeds on identification, on believing, "This is my anger." But when seen clearly, it's just another passing state, neither good nor bad, just impermanent. And like all things that arise, it will also pass. The wise don't act from anger. They act with understanding. There's a famous Zen story. A monk was once scolded unfairly by his teacher in front of the whole monastery. The other monks expected him to retaliate, to explain, to defend his pride, but instead, the monk bowed. And when asked later if he was angry, he smiled gently and said, "The anger came. I saw it. I let it go. That's not weakness. That's mastery." The wise transform anger into compassion because they know the person who hurts you is often hurting too. The angry one is rarely at peace. The cruel one suffers silently in ways no one sees. And when you realize this, your heart softens. It doesn't mean you tolerate injustice or allow harm, but you act without hatred. You speak without poison. You correct without contempt, because you understand anger is a form of suffering, and adding more to the world serves no one. The enlightened treat their own anger the way a kind parent soothes a frightened child, not by yelling at it, not by pretending it's not there, but by holding it gently, understanding its fear, and then letting it go. They don't fight it. They don't feed it. They allow it and watch it dissolve. This is the secret few ever learn. Anger cannot survive in the light of awareness. And those who master this walk through life unshaken, not because the world is kind to them, but because they are kind to themselves. So, the next time anger rises in you, pause, notice it, feel where it lives in your body. Name it without judgment. Anger is here. And then ask yourself, what is this anger asking of me? Is it calling for revenge or for understanding? More often than not, it's the latter, because beneath every anger is pain, and beneath every pain is a longing to be free. This is the path of the wise, the way of the Buddha. Not to never feel anger, but to never be ruled by it, to meet it as you would a storm, knowing it too shall pass, and when it does, the sky of your mind will be clear once more, and you'll realize you were never the anger. You were always the awareness behind it, and in that awareness, there is peace, there is clarity, there is you. We've all been there. One sharp word, one careless act, one betrayal too many, and suddenly anger consumes us. It feels like a wildfire, scorching everything in its path. Our peace, our patience, even our better judgment. And in those moments, it feels impossible to let go. But here's the truth most people never realize. You don't have to hold on to anger for hours, days, or years. You can let go in a single breath. Yes, in a moment. Not because you're weak, not because you're indifferent, but because you understand carrying it costs you everything. In Buddhism, this is known as the art of releasing in the present moment, a skill that anyone can learn. And those who master it live with a peace most of us only dream of. It doesn't mean you pretend it didn't hurt, or that you let people walk over you. It means you refuse to chain yourself to the past. You refuse to be a prisoner of your own mind. Because here's a secret. Anger only exists when you hold onto the story of how you were wronged, the story of what should have happened, the endless replay of moments that no longer exist except in your memory. And in the instant you stop feeding that story, the anger dissolves. So how do you let go in a single moment? You don't fight it. You don't reason with it. You don't suppress it. You turn toward it. You feel it fully, and you allow it to pass. It might sound simple, but it's one of the most courageous acts a human being can do. Because it means facing the raw heat in your chest, the tightening in your throat, the thoughts racing like wildfire in your mind, and in that exact moment, choosing not to fuel them. The Buddha taught, holding onto anger is like grasping a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. You are the one who gets burned. And so, the wise let it go, not because they condone what happened, but because they refuse to burn themselves for the mistakes of others. They understand, the moment you release the anger, you reclaim your freedom. And it doesn't take years of meditation. It takes a moment of clarity. Here's a practice you can use anytime, anywhere. When anger arises, pause, feel it in your body. Notice the heat, the pressure, the tension. Then take a single conscious breath. And as you exhale, say to yourself, I release this. Not because they deserve forgiveness, but because you deserve peace. Repeat it as many times as you need. Notice how, with every breath, the grip of anger loosens. It's no longer you. It's just a sensation passing through. And eventually, like a storm losing its strength, it fades. The art of letting go isn't about forgetting. It's about choosing peace over poison. It's about realizing you are the master of your inner world. No one else controls what you carry or what you release. And when you can let go in a moment, life changes, not because the world grows kinder, but because you stop handing it the keys to your peace. The wise know. Every second spent in anger is a second of joy you'll never get back. And so, they guard their peace as a sacred thing, because it is. So the next time you feel that fire rising inside, remember this: it isn't the event that binds you. It's your clinging to it, and the moment you choose to release it, you are free. And freedom is the most beautiful thing a human heart can know. Let's be honest. Even when we understand anger hurts us more than it heals, even when we know it's better to let go, some moments it clings to us like a shadow we can't shake. It's in those moments that wisdom matters most. Because Buddhism doesn't just tell you to let it go. It hands you tools, simple, timeless techniques used for centuries by monks, sages, and seekers of peace. And today, I want to share 5 of the most powerful. 5 ways to transform anger into clarity, compassion, and strength. 5 techniques that don't just calm you down, they wake you up. Technique 1. Mindful breathing. The first, and perhaps the simplest, is to breathe. Not just any breath, a conscious, mindful, deliberate breath. When anger surges, your body reacts before your mind even has time to catch up. Your heart races, your chest tightens, your breathing grows shallow. The Buddha taught that the breath is the bridge between body and mind. So when anger rises, stop and take 3 deep, mindful breaths. Inhale slowly, hold it for a moment, and exhale, imagining the anger leaving your body with each breath out. This simple act breaks the momentum of anger before it swallows you whole. Technique 2. The pause of perspective. Most anger comes not from what happens, but from how we interpret what happens. The wise pause. When insulted, criticized, or wronged, instead of reacting, they ask, is this truly worth the peace of my heart? They widen their lens. Will this matter a year from now? Does this moment define who I am? Could this person be acting from their own pain, their own ignorance? This pause creates space, and in that space, anger softens. Because often, when you see the bigger picture, what once felt unbearable becomes almost laughable. Technique 3. Loving kindness meditation. Now, this one may sound impossible when you're angry, but that's precisely when it works best. When your heart burns with rage, direct your mind to wish well for yourself first. May I be free from anger. May I be free from suffering. May I be at peace. Then when you feel ready, extend that wish, even to the one who hurt you. May they be free from suffering. May they find peace. It doesn't mean you excuse their actions. It means you refuse to drink the poison of hatred. And when you practice this, even for a few minutes, the sharp edges of anger begin to dull. Technique 4. Reflect on impermanence. Nothing in this world lasts, not your joy, not your sorrow, not even your anger. The Buddha called it anicca, impermanence. When anger arises, remind yourself, this too will pass. This feeling, as intense as it seems, is just a momentary wave. It cannot endure without your consent. Imagine your anger like a storm cloud drifting through the sky of your mind. You are the sky, vast, unshaken, untouched. The cloud may cover the sun for a while, but it cannot stay. And when you truly see this, anger loses its grip. Technique 5. Transform the energy. Anger is energy, and like all energy, it can be redirected. Great masters would say, use the fire of anger not to destroy, but to illuminate. Channel it, go for a walk in nature, write in a journal, practice martial arts or intense physical movement, create something beautiful, serve someone in need. When you turn that heat outward into constructive action, it burns away without harm, and in its place leaves clarity, strength, and wisdom. These 5 techniques aren't just ancient philosophy, they're practical tools for modern life, and those who use them live differently. They don't suppress anger, they don't deny it, they transform it, and through that transformation, they become masters of themselves. Not because life stops provoking them, but because they've learned that peace isn't something the world gives you. It's something you claim moment by moment, breath by breath. In the end, it's not about never feeling anger. It's about what you do when it comes. And the one who can meet anger with wisdom holds in their hands a power far greater than rage could ever offer. A power that calms storms, restores peace, and radiates through every corner of their life. And that, my friend, is the mark of the truly wise. There's a reason stories have lasted longer than stone monuments. Long after empires crumble and names fade into dust, stories remain, carried on the breath of those who remember. And when it comes to anger, some of the greatest lessons aren't found in thick scriptures or scholarly debates. They're hidden in simple, timeless stories, tales whispered by monks under ancient banyan trees, shared between teacher and student, and passed on to those willing to listen. Tonight I'll share with you a few, not just to entertain, but because within them are keys to a calmer, wiser life. The monk and the insult. Once, a young monk traveled far to seek wisdom. After days of walking, he arrived at the gates of a village known for its cruelty to strangers. As he entered, a man cursed him, hurling insults meant to pierce his calm. But the monk simply smiled, bowing gently. Confused and enraged, the man shouted, "Why don't you react? Are you deaf or stupid?" The monk answered softly, "If someone offers you a gift and you refuse to accept it, to whom does the gift belong?" The man faltered. To the one who offered it, he mumbled. "Exactly," the monk said. "I do not accept your anger. It remains yours." And he walked on, leaving the man alone with his rage. A simple story, but in it lies one of Buddhism's most profound truths. Anger only reaches you if you accept it. When you refuse to carry another's poison, you stay free. The 2 monks and the woman. Another time, 2 monks were traveling by foot and came upon a young woman stranded by a flooded river. Without hesitation, the older monk lifted her onto his back, carried her across, and set her down. The younger monk said nothing, but as the hours passed, his frustration grew. Finally, he burst out, "Brother, we are monks. We vowed never to touch a woman. How could you carry her?" The elder monk looked at him serene. "I set her down hours ago," he said. "Why are you still carrying her?" How often do we carry what should have long been left behind? Grudges, old wounds, words that should have been forgotten. The wise know anger lingers only when we let it. Release it and you release yourself. The Buddha and the angry man. And then there's the story of the Buddha himself. One day, a man filled with hatred approached the Buddha, cursing him, spitting vile words. But the Buddha remained still, his face calm, like a quiet lake undisturbed by a storm. When the man finished, exhausted by his own rage, the Buddha spoke. "If a man brings a gift to another but it is not accepted, to whom does the gift belong?" The man, taken aback, stammered, "To the giver, of course." "Then so it is with your anger," the Buddha said. "I do not accept it." The man left, his fury dissolving into confusion and later reflection. The message is timeless. You cannot control what others do, but you can always choose your response. And in that choice lies your freedom. Stories like these aren't just fables, they're mirrors. Each one holds up a reflection of your own life, your own anger, your own responses. Because you and I, we've both met the angry man. We've both been the younger monk. We've both carried burdens long after the moment passed. And we've both had the chance to set them down. The wise aren't born different. They simply learn moment by moment, story by story to let go. So tonight, as you sit in the quiet, ask yourself, what anger am I still carrying? And know that you have the power, right now, in this very breath, to put it down, to leave it where it belongs in the past, and walk forward lighter than before. Some lessons no book can teach. They live in stories and in the hearts of those wise enough to listen. And as we continue, there's one more truth waiting for us. A truth about the victory within. The kind of strength no one sees, but you'll feel in every corner of your being. You see, anger isn't something you defeat once and for all. It's a visitor, one that arrives when you're tired, when someone speaks unfairly, when things fall apart, and the wise don't wait for anger to come knocking before dealing with it. They build small, quiet practices every day that make anger feel like a stranger in their hearts. These aren't grand rituals. They're simple, sacred moments woven into ordinary life. And you can begin right now. Morning check-in. Before the world rushes in, before messages, before headlines, before noise, sit. Close your eyes. Feel your breath rise and fall like waves meeting the shore. Ask yourself, what's stirring inside me today? If you notice irritation or restlessness, name it. Naming a feeling is like turning on a light in a dark room. It loses its power when seen clearly. Do this before you leave your bed, and you'll carry calmness like a shield through your day. Mindful pauses. Anger loves momentum. It thrives in minds that run without stopping. So every few hours, pause, not long, just a breath. Look up from your screen, feel your feet on the ground, listen to the sound of the air. Remind yourself, this moment is enough. I am not my anger. It seems small, but these tiny acts build inner muscle, and over time, you'll notice yourself reacting less, observing more. The silent meal. Once a day, eat in silence, no phone, no distractions, just you, your food, and the awareness of the moment. Notice how anger often comes when we're disconnected from our body, our senses, our now. A simple meal, eaten with attention, teaches you patience. It reminds you that life isn't an emergency. And in that silence, you'll hear the quiet places within you, places untouched by anger. Evening forgiveness ritual. When the day ends, don't carry its heaviness into your night. Sit quietly. Recall anything that sparked irritation, a sharp word, a careless act, and one by one forgive. Not for their sake, but for yours. Whisper softly, even if only in your heart, I release this. I choose peace. You don't have to mean it fully at first, but intention, like a seed, grows. And every evening you practice, you'll find the soil of your heart a little softer. Gratitude as armor. Anger cannot live where gratitude grows. Before sleep, list 3 things, however small, that brought you peace, made you smile, or reminded you of life's beauty. A cool breeze, a kind glance from a stranger, the sound of rain on your window. Gratitude rewires the mind. It turns your gaze from what went wrong to what quietly went right. And soon you'll see, a grateful heart is hard ground for anger to take root. The wise don't wait for storms to pass. They build shelter daily. These practices aren't complicated, but their power lies in their consistency. Anger shrinks not by force, but by being gently outnumbered, by stillness, by forgiveness, by gratitude, by presence. And the more you practice, the less you'll feel like a slave to sudden emotion. You'll move through life with a quiet strength. The kind people notice, though they might not know why. So tonight or tomorrow morning begin. Not because you'll never feel anger again, but because each small act of awareness is a thread in the rope that will one day pull you out of its grasp. The wise keep anger away not by fighting it, but by living in such a way that it finds no home within them. And when you do this, day by day, something incredible happens. You stop chasing peace and start becoming it. And as we near the final chapter of this journey, there's one last lesson, not about anger, but about freedom. A kind of quiet victory that belongs to those who have learned to set down the heaviest burdens and carry nothing but light. And now, we arrive here, not at an ending, but at a doorway, because the truth is that peace isn't a destination. It's a way of walking, a way of breathing, a way of meeting each moment with eyes unclouded, a heart unburdened. And perhaps, somewhere along this journey, something softened inside you. Maybe it was the story of the monk and the insult, or the wisdom of a daily pause, or the gentle reminder that anger, no matter how justified, burns us long before it ever touches another. And that's the secret the wise have always known. They don't live free from anger because the world is gentle. They live free because they choose to carry nothing that doesn't serve their peace. They let go, quickly, fully, and return again and again to the still point within themselves. That quiet place behind every emotion, behind every insult, behind every storm, a place untouched, unshaken, unbreakable. And here's the truth no one tells you. You've had that place all along. You were born with it. It's there now, beneath whatever weight you carry, waiting, not to be found but to be remembered. The wise don't hold anger for more than a moment, not because they're better, but because they've seen what it costs. They've walked the roads of resentment, felt the ache of clinging to what hurts, and chosen every time to set it down. And you can choose that too. Not perfectly, not all at once, but in small, sacred acts, a breath before the reaction, a soft word where a sharp one once lived, a smile in the place of an old grudge. This is how peace is built, not in monasteries alone, but in kitchens, in traffic, in boardrooms, in quiet, lonely evenings. And so as this journey comes to a close, let it be the start of something else. A new way to live, a way where you no longer chase peace, but become it, where you no longer carry what was never yours to hold, where you no longer let anger decide the shape of your days. Because here's the final truth, whispered across centuries of wisdom: a single moment of peace, truly felt, is worth more than a lifetime of victories. And you deserve that moment, every day. Thank you for walking this path. May your days be lighter, your heart clearer, and may you remember in every storm, in every silence, that the moment of peace you seek is already yours. You are the stillness. You are the calm. You are the one who chooses.